and adjust our course of action as necessary. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first needle and syringe programs were opened in the 1980s, often illegally or in a legal gray zone in many countries. I myself was engaged in the efforts to establish such programs in France and later in other countries. I'm not commenting on the slides that you're seeing and that for most of them are sort of self-explanatory, but let me explain this one, which is the state of affairs when in a night we came and installed a prefabricated building to host one of the first methadone clinics and syringe exchange apparatuses in Paris, and that was in the very early 90s. And there was so much opposition. This was a prefabricated building with two doors, one on the street and one in the back on the hospital yard where I was working. And there was so much opposition and so much fear and so many demonstrations outside by neighboring people that that had to be done at night under the protection of the police. We knew at that time that rates of HIV were exploding among people who inject drugs. We also knew that they were often subject to abuse law enforcement officers and even by healthcare providers. At the time, we did not have the strong scientific evidence that the spread of HIV can be significantly reduced by making sterile injecting equipment easily accessible to people who use drugs. But we had to take action. We monitored the results and evaluated the programs thoroughly. And today, it can no longer be disputed, of course, that harm reduction measures, such as needle and syringe programs and substitute therapy, are essential health and human rights services. Here in Canada and elsewhere, the story has been the same with supervised injection sites, which the science has shown time and again are important services, protecting and promoting the health of some of those who are the most marginalized and at risk for HIV and other harms. I will now switch to French for some time.
In the same way, and despite the doubts expressed by many, we started making antiretroviral HIV treatment available in developing countries, and then access while continuing to monitor the results. It's so much to this point that today, even in the most fragile states and even the most difficult settings, people are benefiting from the treatment. And there is, up to now, no alarming evidence of widespread drug resistance. And in fact, we know that adherence rates are as good or nearly as good as in the developed world. There is a substantial body of clinical evidence to show that the drugs work well regardless of the setting. Lives are being saved every day on an unprecedented scale, not only in Toronto, but in Durban or Dushanbe, in Port-au-Prince, in Dar es Salaam, or in Vientiane. The progress that we have achieved represents not only a tremendous public health success, but also a major human rights victory. And I would like here to congratulate those of you, each one of you here tonight who have been champions of human rights and taken a stance for the poorest and most marginalized in this world. I ask you, I call on you to be persistent and to reinvigorate advocacy efforts for human rights and for the treatment and prevention for all. Unfortunately, as Joanne just said earlier on, instead of building upon the successes of the results, too often I meet people who are not believer, and there are even doubters or skeptics, as in the year 2000, 2001, when so many persons tell me and argued against providing treatment in developing countries. Today, yet, we have proven that we can provide treatment to everyone in need. But some vocal people keep on saying that this is not sustainable, that perhaps, and I quote, we should do less, but better. They think that AIDS has received too much attention disproportionately compared to other diseases, and that there is treatment just because the AIDS activists have been louder than advocates for other health problems. Some people are even talking about a treatment mortgage that donors will have to pay in a long-term basis. It's a very negative and inappropriate term, I think, when what we have done is to save lives and give a new hope to millions of people, and that we should be celebrating the treatment success. This backlash on treatment is, for me, a direct backlash against human rights, a backlash that we have to resist. Rather than turning people away from treatment centers or putting them on waiting lists, something that is already happening in too many places every day, we should continue to upscale our work in this area. Of course, I'm not naive. I realize that many countries are facing at this time difficult economic times. But what some may not realize is that poor countries, the poor countries, are still among the hardest hit, and that in times of crisis, their needs are often greatest and even more urgent than others. We should not allow this crisis to increase inequities again, to increase the gap between rich and poor, between north and south. We have to act now, because if we don't, we risk undoing the progress that we have already achieved. In a recent report by the World Bank and by the IMF, they conclude that the progress in poverty reduction made before the economic crisis, particularly in low-income countries in Africa, shows that there is no household in developing countries that is immune. And by the end of this year, an additional 64 million people who will fall into extreme poverty due to the crisis. Even households above the poverty line are coping simply by, among other things, buying cheaper food and reducing their visits to the doctors. It is now urgent that these same financial institutions and international community quickly respond to the crisis with unprecedented millions to support the financial sector and other industries. One of the purposes, as you know, is to eliminate the spread of HIV by 2015 and to reduce the epidemic. So let's be clear, 2010 will be a decisive year. This is the year we decide if we will win the fight against AIDS, and more broadly, if we will meet the health-related Millennium Goals or we will fail. As you know, the world leaders will come here in Muskoka and Toronto in 2 weeks at the G8 and G20 meetings. In July, it'll be the International AIDS Conference in Vienna. Then the African Union Head of State Summit in Kampala in July. And finally, in September, we will have the Millennium Development Goals Summit at the United Nations in New York. And then the Global Fund in October, the Global Fund replenishing the world. The Global Fund gets replenished, and at this meeting, the donors will pledge their contributions to the Global Fund for the next 3 years. And the outcome of these meetings will determine whether we're able or not to continue scaling up programs and ultimately winning this fight, or whether we will waver in our commitment and let progress falter, allowing thus AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria to gain force again. Let me come back in English now.